Well, this is a complex matter, of course. I think you have to take into consideration the traditional Korean virtues, the Confucian virtues of respect for education, respect for authority, industry, thrift, respect for the government to play the role of a patronizing patriarchal teacher. So these are all traditional virtues that can be useful when an authoritarian development model is in place. The people are more prone to curbing their individual desires and bonding together for the communal sake of the nation. At the same time, Confucian virtues alone do not an economic miracle make. You have to have good leadership, you have to have strategy, and you have to also have an external environment that provides you with de facto peace and security, which the United States provided. So the South Korean economic development model in the 60s and 70s and throughout the 1980s, under successive authoritarian authoritarian governments, is one of the government playing a heavy-handed role in subsidizing key industries. It's basically industrial policy based on the Japanese model. The government colluding in a way with big businesses, supporting them, giving them low interest loans with shady exchange of money under the table between business and government and so on. But in the South Korean case, there were two events in the mid-1960s which were tremendously helpful to which were very helpful to further accelerating South Korea's economic development, both in 1965. The first was the normalization of diplomatic relations with Japan. This was a hugely controversial affair. Such were the residual, strong anti-Japanese sentiment on the part of the South Korean people. Japan's colonization of Korea was in many ways uniquely oppressive, and South Koreans feared that had South Korea to normalize diplomatic relations with Japan, Japan would use its economic might and encroach upon Korean interests, perhaps even make South Korea Japan's economic colony, as many people feared. And there were many rounds of anti-government protests against normalizing relations with Japan. Well, it was done under an authoritarian government, under General Park Chung-hee. And when the normalization treaty took effect, Japan, per the agreement of 1965, gave South Korea about $800 million worth of aid, economic assistance, as it was called. And the South Korean government, actually put that money to good use instead of building showy hotels and resorts, as we see in other authoritarian settings. Park Chung-hee put that money into good use and built highways, broadened roads, built buildings, factories, dams, bridges, invested in steel. And that was, in the end, effective in further advancing South Korea's economic development. Another major issue in 1965 was also controversial, but practically speaking, the right thing to do, which was to send combat troops to Vietnam in support of the United States. And this was controversial. Opposition Korean politicians rightfully pointed out that South Korea would be akin to playing the role of mercenary in supporting the U.S. war campaign. It was an unjust, immoral war, many decried. But what happened was the United States needed support. The United States needed combat troops. And South Korea from 1965 to 1971 sent 300,000 combat troops, South Korean troops. They were paid by the United States government. They were equipped, trained, and clothed by the US government. And by 1971, you have about $1 billion worth of currency, hard cash currency, flowing into the South Korean economy. So those were two of the more controversial decisions made by Park Chung-hee, the military leader. But I think history has probably evaluated, assessed those controversial decisions. First, normalizing relations with Japan, and second, sending combat troops to Vietnam as the right decision.